An ancient political science joke, and we are assuming that a foreign desk listener is the ideal audience for such, tells of a zealous ideologue hearing of a successful policy and retorting, "So it works in practice, but does it work in theory?" If you laughed at this gag, you may be a centrist, one of those people who believes that politics should be a mechanism for getting things done, rather than a means of keeping score in abstruse disputes with one's ideological adversaries. Centrism, at least as its advocates see it, is a creed which enables the picking of the best ideas from left and right to construct a programme of governance which is collegiate, consensual and civilised. Unsurprisingly, especially in a world polarised by social media purity contests, this makes a lot of people very angry, or perhaps just a small number of people very loud. In British discourse, centrist dad has become a term of abuse, generally aimed at the kind of person who was probably pretty happy with how the UK's most recent general election turned out. Inevitably, if not downright triumphantly, centrist dads have embraced the insult as a badge of honour. The difficulty, a difficulty with centrism, is that it is often presented not in terms of what it is, but what it isn't. It isn't dogmatic, it isn't deluded, it isn't divisive. As centrist politicians often discover, however, it is a perilously fine line between pleasing everybody and pleasing nobody. What actually is centrism? How can it be practically applied? And why does it often seem to inflame populism rather than extinguish it? This is the Foreign Desk.
When things are looking up and it works, people like it. But in an era of people getting their news from algorithms that are essentially feeding them what they already believe, politics has been transformed, and this stridency of political discourse is not something that France has been able to escape.
I don't want centrism to be portrayed as afraid of taking a stand. I mean, you can have a very centrist policy on the Russia-Ukraine that absolutely condemns and abhors and takes a strong stand against Vladimir Putin and his aggression.
If we can connect and offer a real sense of empathy with the fears that people feel and the grievances that people have, then we can come to them and say, we understand you, we feel what you're feeling, but the answers that they're offering you, the answers that the populists are putting on the table, they're not going to work. And here's a positive vision for the future. So I think that's how you make it land. And when you look at successful centrist leaders throughout history, they've nearly always had that positive message.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller. If there is one politician who in recent times has served as an avatar for what people mean, both admiringly and not, when they talk about centrism, it is French President Emmanuel Macron, who recently called a snap election to cut off the far right and found himself at loggerheads with the far left. I'm joined first of all by Monocle's new Paris bureau chief, Simon Bouvier, who joined us only in the last month and has been thrown headlong into France's post-Olympic political crisis. So, Simon, first of all, as far as it's possible to tell, what on earth is going on now?
Well, Andrew, there were talks late last week and early this week, and the only result has been calling a new round of talks, this time excluding a government led by the largest group in the Assemblée nationale, the Nouveau Front Populaire. So their chosen candidate, which was the only kind of named candidate by parties after the legislative elections, has been ruled out. So there will be no leftist government, but the rest is yet unknown.
What is Macron's specific problem, as far as we can tell, with the idea of a leftist government, especially if this is more or less what the people of France elected?
So there's two parallel things. The first thing is that even though the Nouveau Front Populaire is the largest group in French parliament, essentially, it's still only 30% of the votes. And for the remaining 70% of the Assemblée nationale, any part of them governing is a red line, and they've said that they will immediately vote them out of office if Macron chooses a prime minister from that camp. So there was some horse trading over will there be ministers from such and such party in the government or not. But what we found out on Monday is that all of that was a bit of a pretext, and that really the issue that these other more right-leaning parties have is the program of the NFP, which includes rolling back the retirement age from 64 back to 60, and other issues, including cultural ones, immigration, etc., that they cannot stand. So that's the first thing. And then on the left, there's the feeling that basically by not selecting their chosen candidate, Macron is essentially ignoring the result of the legislative elections that he called. So I think Macron's stuck between a rock and a hard place here, because it's either instability with a government that is essentially guaranteed to be overthrown by a vote of no confidence, or accusations that he is ignoring the will of the people by ruling out the first group in parliament.
Well, to move seamlessly along to the subject of this week's episode more broadly, is this Macron trying to find a way through the result of this election, which, as you correctly point out, he called to perpetuate his brand of centrism somehow?
Yeah, I think, Andrew, there's a lot of discussion about whether this is him trying to find excuses to preserve his legacy. One of his signature policies since he came into office in 2017 was spearheading this retirement reform that increased the retirement age from 62, which it was previously, to 64. And he definitely is thinking about his legacy at this point, and he does not want this to be canceled. That does not mean that the argument about electoral math isn't a very solid one, because even if the left is the largest group, if you look at the political leanings of parliament as a whole, I think the center of gravity is essentially on the center right. So part of this is definitely him trying to preserve his legacy and his signature policies, but I think his argument about the electoral math is definitely a sound one.
On the subject of that legacy, do we understand yet what that is? Is there a centrist ideal, if you like, that Macron wants to bequeath to France? We have had a decent stretch of him as president by now. We should have some idea what he's all about. Has he successfully articulated to the French people, at least, his idea of what his centrist philosophy is?
Well, I think he has successfully articulated it, but the results of these legislative elections show that they're tired of it. You know, at the beginning, when everybody thought he was a joke candidate, he managed to bring France into a world where instead of having alternating center-right and center-left governing parties, you had a centrist party that took the best bits of the center-left and the best bits of the center-right and relegated the kind of classic governance parties to the fringes, because it appealed to everybody, right? On the left, they thought, oh, he has all of these great items that are priorities for us in his program. And on the right, it was the same feeling. And now, after 1.5 terms of Macron, it's kind of the opposite, where neither side is satisfied with how he has governed. The people on the left think he has been way too hardline on immigration, among other things, on cultural issues, to protect himself from being overrun politically by the far right. And then on the right, they consider that his policies have been too soft on a number of things. So where before the magic was that everybody saw something that they liked, now nobody does, and everybody sees things that they don't like. That's the state of the centrism that he created.
So have we possibly learned from this then, and I guess if there was one country we were going to learn it from, it would be France, that despite this idea that centrism projects that it is logical and it is rational and it merely wants to deal with what works rather than what satisfies some ideological dogma, that people actually quite like ideological dogma. It is important to them, it defines them and how they see the world, and it's a tough thing to override.
Absolutely. I think it also depends a lot on the personality of the person. I think one thing that we haven't discussed yet and that we shouldn't kind of put on the back of centrism as a governing principle or ideology is that Macron himself as an individual is highly unpopular and people consider him to be haughty and arrogant and disdainful. And so I think that kind of charisma is something that has been lacking from the French equation. So I wouldn't say for sure that it's about the centrism. I think, as usual, when things are looking up and it works, people like it. But in an era of social media and people getting their news from algorithms that are essentially feeding them what they already believe, politics has been transformed. There's not as much space as there used to be for discussions about policy platforms, etc. And this stridency of political discourse is not something that France has been able to escape.
Simon Bouvier, Monocle's Paris bureau chief, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. If, as President Macron is discovering, it's hard enough to apply centrism to one perpetually and proverbially rambunctious country, what possible use can it be in addressing a whole rancorous world? I'm joined now by Michèle Flournoy, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, currently co-founder and CEO of the Center for a New American Security. Michèle, let's try and start by defining our terms. If we think about centrism in a foreign policy context, how would you briefly sum that up as an approach?
I would say centrism is based on pragmatism and principle, but it really stems from a non-ideological perspective, a problem-solving perspective that's designed to take on challenges and figure out the best possible, feasible means of addressing them. So it seeks to create, in the U.S. context, a bipartisan space or consensus around what is possible to advance U.S. interests and values. So that's how I would define it.
Over the journey, though, how often do you think that actually has been the defining creed of U.S. foreign policy? Because it's not like U.S. foreign policy hasn't been seized with ideological zeal once or twice.
Many times in our history. But I think that, when you look at the Cold War, not the early Cold War period of McCarthyism, but once we sort of settled into a reasonable approach, across many administrations, Republican and Democrat, you had more consistency of direction in that policy for dealing with containing the former Soviet Union than you had massive swings of policy or departures from the center. And so I would argue that, yes, there were variations on the theme, but for a number of decades, we had a fairly strong bipartisan consensus around the threat that the Soviet Union posed, the role of the United States in rallying the West to counter that threat, and many of the core policies that were implemented across multiple administrations with ultimately, having pretty significant success.
Is a centrist foreign policy approach necessarily about avoiding picking a side, or is it possible to unequivocally pick a side and still think of yourself as pursuing a centrist foreign policy?
It's not really about picking sides. It is about how do we build enough consensus to move in the right direction to deal with the threats and opportunities before us. So, I think extreme positions tend to lead you to an all or nothing approach, whereas a more pragmatic centrist approach tends to lead you to, okay, what can we get done now as the first steps in the right direction? So it is more open to compromise. Compromise is not a dirty word using a centrist approach. It is a sign of pragmatism. What can we get done in the situation we find ourselves now, strategically, politically, economically, et cetera? And knowing that in the future, we'll take another bite at the apple or many bites at the apple to keep refining the policy and moving it forward. So I think it's not about taking sides. It's about finding common ground to move forward in the right direction.
But if we apply that thinking to, I guess if we think of the two biggest foreign policy challenges that the United States faces right now, Ukraine and Gaza, it has taken a fairly different approach to both of those. It has placed itself very firmly in Ukraine's corner where Ukraine is concerned. Where Israel and Gaza is concerned, there's been a continual line in reinforcing the United States' broad support for Israel, but patience with Israel's approach is fairly visibly dwindling. Does the approach in either of those circumstances, especially Ukraine, I guess, where the US has definitely picked a side, is that a centrist approach there, do you think?
You can oppose Vladimir Putin's unlawful, unjustified, horrific aggression and still be a centrist. I think the question is, can you build bipartisan support for how we're going to deal with that aggression? And I think that, frankly, Ukraine's an example up until recently that we have had a bipartisan approach. You've had Congress support numerous bills to fund the equipping of Ukraine, the training of Ukraine, broad bipartisan support for expanding NATO to include Finland and Sweden and strengthening of NATO. I think what you have here is an outlier of President Trump, who sort of questions that our support for Ukraine, questions the value of NATO, but that's more a debate within the Republican Party. And thus far, it has not prevented most Republicans in Congress or enough Republicans in Congress coming along to support Ukraine. So again, I don't want centrism to be portrayed as afraid of taking a stand. I mean, you can have a very centrist policy on the Russia-Ukraine that absolutely condemns and abhors and takes a strong stand against Vladimir Putin and his aggression.
You mentioned President Trump, and we have had 4 more years of him. We may be about to get 4 more years of him. But for all of his disruptive bluster, did US foreign policy change notably on his watch, do you think?
I think in the first Trump term, I think there are many instances where Trump's instincts were to fundamentally take foreign policy outside the historic consensus. For example, Trump, am unhappy with the trade imbalance with South Korea. Therefore, when the South Korean leader comes to Washington, I'm going to threaten to pull out all of U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula until the trade balance is improved. But he was stopped from pursuing that by many of his advisors and his cabinet members. Same with NATO. I think if it were up to Trump, he might have withdrawn from NATO, but he was under enough pressure from those around him that he was stopped. I think the big question going forward, if there were a second Trump term, would be this time, will he surround himself with pragmatists or with fellow ideological travelers who are not going to stop him from acting on his impulses and could very quickly end up taking us outside the bounds of that bipartisan consensus that historically has led to a more pragmatic and, I would argue, successful foreign policy.
But in applying this idea of centrism in foreign policy, a creed of, pragmatic practicalities, what can we actually get done? Let's do what we can rather than worry about what we can't. How does any president, any administration, any government anywhere guard against, because people do this all the time. Nobody embarks on any enterprise thinking this is insane ideologically crazed hubris, which is completely unjustifiable according to logical reason. People try to justify things to themselves. How do you guard against mistaking what you want to do for what's actually going to work?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I think a lot of, a pragmatic approach, it explores exactly those trade-offs. It begets a leadership style within the government that really welcomes all views, dissenting views, fully explores the decision space, if you will. Here's what we'd like to do ideally. Is that possible? What are the risk trade-offs? How do I protect U.S. interests and values as much as possible, advance them, while also making sure that the level of risk is acceptable? It's not coming up with a preordained cookie cutter answer. It is fully exploring exactly the trade-offs that you're talking about before deciding what to actually do. And there are times when presidents rightly decide that something is too important to the United States that, we are going to pursue this, even though there's a lot of risk associated with it. And there are other times when presidents decide that that risk is more than the traffic will bear, and we're going to moderate our objectives. But that is the art of decision-making at that level.
But to bring this back then to one obvious real-world example, i.e. Gaza, what, as you see it, would be actually a centrist approach to dealing with that?
I actually think that, the Biden administration or Biden-Harris administration has taken a pretty centrist approach. They've been very clear that, number one, the U.S. clearly supports Israel's right to exist and respond to the horrific attacks of October 7th. But the United States also believes that the way in which you prosecute a war in Gaza matters, and the kind of humanitarian catastrophe that has been created there is not acceptable and needs to be addressed. And that ultimately, as we think about, push for a ceasefire, push to get the hostages home, you also have to push for an answer to the Palestinian question. The two-state solution remains a critical element of the solution, especially if we're trying to ultimately win some kind of realignment of the Middle East with the Gulf states and the United States and Israel doing more to contain Iran and its proxies who've been so destabilizing in the region for so long. So I think that approach is a centrist approach. We haven't been able to get Netanyahu to go along with it. We haven't been able to get Hamas to agree to the terms of an agreement yet, but I think the administration's on the right track. I would like to see even more emphasis on addressing the humanitarian crisis that has unfolded in Gaza, which is just, horrific.
Do you get any sense from where you are that the public view of American foreign policy has become notably less centrist than the government's view, that perhaps public opinion in the United States has become more isolationist for the experiences of Afghanistan and Iraq, that it wants to extricate the US from various foreign entanglements rather than try to sort them out?
I think the polarization of our domestic politics, particularly with Trump as a candidate and the way he speaks to the public, I think it has further polarized views on foreign policy. That said, when you poll Americans and you ask them about true isolationism versus having allies and working alongside others to achieve our objectives, they consistently come down on the side of being engaged, having allies, not going it alone, etc. And that's been true for many, many years. So I do think the domestic political polarization is infecting the rhetoric on foreign policy, but I think the majority of Americans still understand that the United States, it's in our interest to stay engaged in the world, to play a leadership role in the world, to secure ourselves at home and to secure our prosperity and our future.
That was Michèle Flournoy, former US Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. This is The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. A criticism frequently made of centrism applies not so much to the creed itself as its consequences, that a period of centrist stasis tends to encourage eruptions of extremism. In the US, the transition from President Barack Obama to President Donald Trump is one such example. In the UK, the collapse of collegiate Cameroonian conservatism into the fervid seethings of Brexit is another. And another country where centrism has been subsumed by radicalism and with grim consequences is Israel. I'm joined finally here in the studio by Yair Zivan, advisor to former Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid, author and editor of a new book, The Centre Must Hold, which was also the impetus for this episode of The Foreign Desk. First of all, I think arguably one of the difficulties with centrism, as we were explaining in the introduction, is outlining what it is, because it's usually framed as an absence of ideology, of dogma, of general shrieking hysterical emotion. But what actually is centrism in your mind?
So I think you're right. I think people tend to define it or misdefine it by what it isn't rather than by what it is. So I will quickly say what it isn't. Centrism isn't the middle. It isn't a search for splitting the difference between wherever the extremes happen to be dragging us at the moment, wherever the far right or the far left drag us, and then trying to split the difference between them. That isn't centrism. Centrism is based around a set of core values, principles, and then tries to frame the political debate, the political arena around those. So what are some of those values? It's an embrace of what I call and others call liberal patriotism. It's a belief in equality of opportunity. It's an unflinching defense of liberal democracy. And I think the institutions that uphold it. It's easy to be in favor of it in principle, but you also have to support a free press, even if you don't like everything they say, and an independent judiciary, even if you don't like every ruling. A peaceful transition of power, even when you lose. So there are core values that I think underpin centrism. And then from that, you draw a kind of a political culture, which is how I think you identify real centrists. Part of that is an understanding that in a complex world, solutions are also complicated. We have to balance between competing tensions. Globalization is good because it brings down the cost of your shop at the local supermarket because you can buy things cheaper from abroad. But it also affects local industry and it harms local communities. And you have to find the balance between those. We have a responsibility to provide national security for people. But we do that while also trying to balance that with our civil rights. How do we make sure that both of those can coexist? We embrace technological progress and advance, but we also understand that it comes with harms. The ability to deal with that complexity, to deal with those tensions is, I think, at the core of what centrism is. And one of the things that I think comes out in the book is a series of approaches that help deal with that, which is to say, compromise is a virtue, not a vice, as long as it's founded in a set of values. Moderation is a positive quality in democratic politics. Pragmatism moves us forward, and that's a good thing. We shouldn't be scared of it. And it leaves us with a challenge, which is usually the follow-up, which is how can you be as passionate about those things as the radicals are about the things that they're passionate about?
That is the thing I want to come back to, the difficulty of arguing in favour of centrism and against those forces it's usually up against. But just, I guess, one further question of definition. It is received wisdom, and there's plenty of evidence for the supposition that the yahoos and the headbangers are on the march, that they are making progress, that centrism is in retreat. As you look around the political landscape now, is there one or two particular examples of a centrist leader or a centrist government, as you would see it, that is actually holding its own and getting things done?
I know it's counterintuitive, but I'm actually not sure I agree with the perceived wisdom that that the radicals are on the rise. Politics is a pendulum. There's a swing always. The most effective political movements don't win every election, and that's okay. But I would say much of Joe Biden's agenda has been a democratic one. I would say President Macron has won 2 presidential elections in a row as a new candidate, a centrist candidate in French politics, despite some of the challenges he's facing now. In Israel today, after the horrors of October 7th, the Israeli public actually moved back towards the centre rather than moving further right, and all the opinion polls point to the next government being a centre-left, centre-right government. And I think even if you look at the European parliamentary elections, actually the balance of power didn't change that dramatically. By all accounts, the next EU foreign minister is going to be the centrist Prime Minister of Estonia. Ursula von der Leyen is going to keep her position. So in the end, those kind of centrist forces have actually held their power.
So if centrism then is at least winning some arguments and even more importantly, winning some elections, what has it actually discovered about what arguments work? Because it's easy to understand at this point how the populist works. The populist stands up in front of people who are angry, often for not really terribly good reasons, tells them that none of their problems are their fault, says all the solutions are very, very simple, and usually points at someone else and says, actually, it's all their fault, so that's who you can blame. Whereas, as you said earlier, centrism is all about, and it's true, that it's not easy to fix things. It is complicated, it is time-consuming, it's usually boring and expensive, and up to a point, you are just going to have to kind of trust us. That is not a sexy, motivating, emotive argument. So how do you make it land?
So I think there's 2 primary things I'd say that help make the message land. And I think you're right about the key of populism is to divide us into us and them. There's an in-group and an out-group. We're usually the suppressed or the mistreated, and there's the other group that's holding us back or holding us down. That's the way populists tend to split society. And when populists try to campaign with division and fear and stoking hatred, the only way to compete with that is with the opposite. And it's what I talk about in the book. I quote the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, talks about the politics of hope, with hope being an active virtue that says, it's not a naive optimism that says everything will be okay. It's an active virtue that says, if we get it right, if we work at it, we can make things better. That's one part of it, to offer a positive message that says, actually, I believe in people. And I do. I think if we give people the tools and the opportunities, I think people have the ability to overcome incredible adversity. They do so in their daily lives, and they can do it as a wider society and as a country. I'm incredibly passionate about that belief in people. The second thing we have to do, and this goes a little bit to your question, we have to connect with the fears that people feel. I do think some of them are worth listening to and genuine. It's okay that people are concerned about technological progress and what it might do to their jobs. When you hear all the time that AI is coming for your factory or for your industry, it's okay that that's scary. And we have a responsibility to engage genuinely with those fears. I think it's okay that people worry that mass migration is going to fundamentally change the way that their country is and the things they love about their country. If we can connect and offer a real sense of empathy with the fears that people feel and the grievances that people have, then we can come to them and say, we understand you, we feel what you're feeling, but the answers that they're offering you, the answers that the populists are putting on the table, they're not going to work. They're going to make things worse. They don't actually offer you solutions, and here's how we're actually going to fix things for you, and here's a positive vision for the future. So I think that's how you make it land, and when you look at successful centrist leaders throughout history, they've nearly always had that positive message. Macron's message throughout his first election campaign was upbeat and positive. Tony Blair and New Labour's things can only get better, and Bill Clinton's A Place Called Hope, and Obama's entire Hope campaign were all driven by a positive message. And I think that's the way you overcome the populists and the extremists.
But all that said, is centrism, because it plays by the rules and it believes in institutions and it believes in law and order, is it always going to be doomed to be patiently waiting its turn? You mentioned the pendulum, which is a factor in politics. I think it's perfectly arguable, though, that Donald Trump is not Barack Obama's fault. You can't have Donald Trump unless you had Barack Obama first. In fact, David Axelrod has written much the same, so I'm happy to take his word for it. I think you can probably draw a line from 13 years of Labour government in this country to radical conservatism, austerity and Brexit. And the pendulum in France has swung out the other way as well, and may swing as far as a scarcely reformed fascist being elected president in a couple of years. Is there any way that centrism, once having one power, can keep that pendulum in place, or is that just an ineluctable fact of politics?
I think it is possible to keep it for large amounts of time, at least to try to limit how far it swings. It's okay that there's a swing to social democrats and conservatives sometimes away from the political centre where I would put myself. That's within the normal rules of the game. What we have to try and do is protect from the swings to the very extremes. And we focus on Europe a lot of the time where it's to the far right, but look at somewhere like Latin America where the swing is now very much to the illiberal left. So I do think we can keep hold of that. One of those things comes back to not being a passive movement that waits for its moment, but rather makes the case that I'm trying to make in this book and I'm trying to make here with passion. We believe in these things. We're as committed to these things as anybody else is. And how do you translate that into politics? If I am a member of a large political party in a predominantly two-party system, I need to know that the leader of my party understands that the centrist wing, the centrist faction of the party is as committed, as passionate about its values as the fringes are. So if the fringes say, you won't get my 10, 15 votes unless you pander to my radical agenda, the centre needs to say, we are as committed, as passionate as they are, and there's more of us. And if you don't go along what we want to do, if you don't make the steps that we want you to take, you're not going to be able to get anything done without us. And I think if we make that case strongly, we'll manage to keep politics within what I think are healthier boundaries that create better policy, and ultimately not to lose sight of what the goal of this. The goal is not to win elections for the sake of winning elections. It's to win elections so that you can put in place policy, legislation, reforms that make people's lives better.
Yair Zivan, author and editor of The Centre Must Hold. Thank you very much for joining us on the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week with a special edition from the GlobeSec Forum, this year held in Prague. And look out for the Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces the Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email chris@cc@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.
"2024 is a defining year for global politics as more people head to the polls than ever before. How will shifts in power impact you? The Financial Times provides fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists provide impartial analysis of the economy, politics, and business, so you can join the dots and see the full picture. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.